In the early 1980s, something historic quietly came to an end. In 1982, the enormous gates of Singer Manufacturing Company's factory in Elizabeth, New Jersey, closed for the final time. For more than 100 years, that factory had been one of the most powerful symbols of American industry. At its peak, the complex covered more than 100 acres of land, contained dozens of buildings, and employed thousands of workers who produced sewing machines at a scale the world had never witnessed before. For generations, the Singer name had become almost inseparable from sewing itself. By the early 1900s, the company controlled nearly the entire American market for home sewing machines. In fact, the brand became so dominant that many people stopped saying sewing machine altogether. Instead, they simply called it a Singer. Walk into almost any American household during that era, and you would likely see one sitting proudly in the living room. These machines were not just tools. They were furniture, heirlooms, and symbols of progress. Owning a Singer meant you were part of the modern world. But Singer's influence went far beyond sewing. The company transformed how people bought products. It introduced one of the earliest installment payment systems, allowing customers to purchase expensive items over time instead of paying everything up front. Today, that concept is normal in retail, but back then, it was revolutionary. Singer even built the tallest office building in the world in 1908, a skyscraper that stood as a monument to the company's incredible success. Through the decades, Singer survived enormous challenges: 2 world wars, economic crises, the Great Depression, changing markets. For over a century, the company seemed unstoppable. And then, surprisingly, everything began to collapse. Within less than 20 years, factories shut down, workers lost their jobs, and what was once an industrial empire slowly turned into a collection of abandoned buildings and toxic industrial land. So how does a company that powerful fall so dramatically? To understand that story, we need to go all the way back to the beginning, and to the man who started it all. Interestingly, the founder of Singer was not a brilliant engineer or a wealthy businessman. He was a failed dreamer. Isaac Merritt Singer was born in 1811 in a small town in New York. His childhood was far from comfortable. His father was a mechanic who had immigrated from Europe, and the family struggled financially. Things became even more difficult when Isaac was still very young. His parents separated and his family life quickly fell apart. By the time he was a teenager, he had already run away from home. But Isaac had a dream, and that dream had nothing to do with machines. He wanted to become an actor. Specifically, he dreamed of performing Shakespeare on stage. For years, he traveled from town to town trying to make that dream a reality. He even formed his own small theater group and spent nearly 2 decades chasing a career in acting. Unfortunately, the dream never worked out. The theater company struggled, the performances brought little money, and Isaac eventually found himself deeply in debt. By his 30s, he was broke, frustrated, and running out of options. At this point, life forced him to reconsider his future. Desperate to make money, he began experimenting with mechanical inventions. In 1839, he developed a machine designed for drilling through rock. It seemed promising, but the invention never found investors or buyers. Once again, Isaac's hopes collapsed. Meanwhile, his personal life was extremely chaotic. He had relationships with multiple women and fathered several children, often leaving one family behind while starting another in a different city. Despite all this instability, Isaac possessed one quality that would eventually change everything. He was incredibly stubborn. And sometimes stubborn people end up changing history. Around 1850, while working as a repairman in a workshop in Boston, Isaac encountered a broken sewing machine that someone had brought in for repairs. At that time, sewing machines already existed, but they were complicated, unreliable, and difficult to use. Most mechanics would have simply repaired the machine and moved on. But Isaac did something different. Instead of fixing the machine, he studied it carefully. And he realized something important. The design itself was flawed. Rather than repairing the machine, Isaac decided to completely redesign it. That single decision, made in a small, messy repair shop, would soon change not only his life, but an entire global industry. And the result of that decision would become one of the most successful inventions in industrial history. But the breakthrough didn't come easily. In fact, it happened during one of the most intense working periods of Isaac Singer's life. For 11 straight days, he worked almost without sleep. And what he created during that time would launch an empire. Isaac Singer's life had been filled with failures up to that point. His acting career collapsed. His inventions never made money. And by the late 1840s, he was still struggling to find a stable future. But everything began to change in a small Boston workshop. One day in 1850, a broken sewing machine was brought into the repair shop where Singer was working. At first glance, it looked like a normal repair job. Sewing machines already existed at the time, but they were awkward, fragile, and extremely frustrating to use. Most mechanics would have simply fixed the machine, charged a small fee, and moved on. Singer didn't. Instead, he stared at the machine for a long time, carefully analyzing how it worked. As he studied the design, he noticed several problems that made the machines inefficient. The needle moved sideways in an unnatural motion, the fabric was difficult to control, and the overall system was complicated and slow. To Singer, the issue wasn't just a broken machine. The entire concept needed improvement. So rather than repairing the machine, he decided to rebuild it completely. Singer locked himself inside the workshop and began experimenting. For nearly 2 weeks, he worked almost non-stop. According to later accounts, he barely slept and rarely left the room. He was obsessed with solving the problem. After 11 intense days of work, Singer finally produced a new design that changed everything. The improvement might sound simple today, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Singer introduced a straight, vertically moving needle combined with a horizontal working surface where the fabric could rest. This design allowed the material to move smoothly beneath the needle instead of fighting against the machine. He also added something that became one of the most important features of modern sewing machines: a foot pedal. This pedal allowed the operator to power the machine with their foot while keeping both hands free to guide the fabric. That meant the user had much better control over the stitching. These changes dramatically increased efficiency. Before machines like Singer's, sewing by hand was painfully slow. A skilled person could manage maybe 30 or 40 stitches per minute. Singer's machine could produce nearly 900 stitches per minute. That difference didn't just make sewing faster. It completely transformed the process. Tasks that once required hours of exhausting manual labor could now be completed in a fraction of the time. Clothing production suddenly became faster, easier, and far more consistent. Recognizing the importance of his invention, Singer filed for a patent in 1851. But success did not arrive peacefully. In fact, it immediately triggered a legal battle. Another inventor named Elias Howe had previously patented key elements of a sewing machine design. When Howe saw Singer's rapidly growing business, he believed Singer's machine used ideas covered by his earlier patent. So Howe sued. The lawsuit lasted for years and became one of the most important patent battles in early American industrial history. Eventually, the court ruled that Howe's patent claims were valid. Singer was forced to pay a large financial settlement and ongoing royalties for every machine sold. For a moment, it seemed like the entire business might collapse before it even began. But instead of destroying the industry, the conflict led to an unusual solution. In 1856, several sewing machine manufacturers reached an agreement known as the Albany Patent Pool. Instead of constantly suing each other, companies would share their key patents and divide the royalty payments. This allowed the industry to grow without endless legal battles. For Singer, it meant survival. But inventing the machine was only half the story. The real success of the company came from something else entirely: business strategy. Around this time, a lawyer named Edward Clark joined Singer's company. Clark was very different from Isaac Singer. While Singer was emotional, impulsive, and chaotic, Clark was calm, analytical, and extremely strategic. Clark understood something crucial about the sewing machine market. The problem wasn't demand. The problem was price. At the time, a sewing machine could cost over $100, an enormous amount of money for an average household in the mid-1800s. Most families simply couldn't afford one, even if they wanted it. So Clark introduced a groundbreaking idea. Instead of requiring customers to pay the full price up front, Singer would allow them to pay in installments. A customer could pay a small amount at the beginning, then continue making smaller monthly payments until the machine was fully paid off. Today, this concept seems normal, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Suddenly, thousands of families who could never afford a sewing machine now had access to one. But Clark's innovations didn't stop there. Singer began opening dedicated showrooms where customers could see demonstrations of the machines. Instead of just selling through wholesalers, the company marketed directly to consumers. Even more interesting, the company targeted a group that most businesses ignored at the time: women. Since women were the primary users of sewing machines, Singer began advertising directly to them in magazines and public demonstrations. Female sales representatives were hired to show how the machines worked and how they could transform daily life. This strategy was incredibly successful. Demand exploded. Within just a few years, Singer Manufacturing Company became one of the fastest-growing industrial businesses in America. The sewing machine was no longer just a mechanical invention. It had become a household revolution, and Singer was quickly turning that invention into a global empire. By the early 1870s, Singer Manufacturing Company was facing a new kind of problem. Demand for their sewing machines was exploding. Orders were pouring in from across the United States and increasingly from other parts of the world. The small workshops and scattered production facilities that had once been enough could no longer keep up. Edward Clark, the strategic mind behind the company's business success, realized something important. If Singer wanted to maintain its dominance, it needed to think much bigger. Much bigger. So the company made a bold decision. They would build one of the largest manufacturing facilities the world had ever seen. The location chosen for this ambitious project was Elizabethport, New Jersey. At the time, it was a growing industrial area located near important transportation routes. This location was not chosen randomly. It had direct access to waterways connected to the Atlantic Ocean, which meant finished products could easily be shipped overseas. It also had railroad connections that allowed raw materials and completed machines to move quickly across the country. Equally important, the region had a large population of immigrant workers looking for stable employment. In 1871, construction began. Just 1 year later, the new Singer factory opened its doors, and it immediately became one of the most impressive industrial facilities in America. The factory complex started with around 30 acres of land, but it would continue expanding for decades. Eventually, it would grow into a massive industrial campus covering more than 100 acres, with dozens of buildings dedicated to different parts of the manufacturing process. What made the facility so remarkable wasn't just its size. It was how the entire system worked together. Singer designed the factory to be almost completely self-sufficient. Instead of relying on outside suppliers for many parts, the company produced most of the components on site. There was a foundry where molten metal was poured into molds to create machine frames. There were workshops where iron and steel were shaped into smaller mechanical parts. Precision machine shops drilled, cut, and polished those pieces into exact measurements. Power for the entire complex came from large steam engines fueled by enormous amounts of coal. Every week, hundreds of tons of coal were burned to keep the factory running. Inside the complex, even the movement of materials was organized with incredible efficiency. Small internal railway tracks ran between buildings, allowing carts filled with metal parts and raw materials to move easily from one department to another. It was almost like a giant mechanical organism. Raw materials entered one side of the complex, moved through different stages of production, and eventually emerged as finished sewing machines ready to be shipped around the world. The production process itself was carefully divided into specialized stages. In one building, workers cast the heavy metal frames that formed the base of each machine. In another, precision equipment shaped smaller components such as gears, screws, and needle mechanisms. Assembly workers then fitted those parts together, ensuring every piece worked perfectly. After assembly, the machines moved to finishing departments where they were polished. Finally, they were carefully packed into wooden crates and prepared for long journeys across oceans and continents. For the late 1800s, this level of industrial organization was extraordinary. Singer had essentially built an early form of large-scale mass production, years before similar systems became famous in other industries. And the impact went far beyond the company itself. The presence of the Singer factory transformed Elizabethport almost overnight. Thousands of workers arrived looking for jobs. Entire neighborhoods grew around the factory as housing was built for employees and their families. Shops, restaurants, schools, and churches appeared to serve the rapidly growing population. The steady rhythm of machinery and factory whistles became the heartbeat of the town. For more than a century, the Singer factory would define the community. But Singer's ambitions were not limited to one city, or even one country. As demand for sewing machines increased worldwide, the company began expanding internationally. Factories were built in Europe to serve overseas markets more efficiently. One of the largest facilities opened in Scotland, becoming another massive center of sewing machine production. Later, Singer also established manufacturing operations in Russia and other parts of the world. At the same time, the company created an enormous global sales network. Singer showrooms appeared in cities across multiple continents. Sales representatives traveled from town to town, demonstrating the machines and offering installment payment plans. By the early 1900s, Singer had become one of the most recognizable brands on earth. In many countries, owning a Singer sewing machine became a symbol of modern life. Families used them to make clothing, repair garments, and even start small businesses from their homes. The machines were not only practical tools, they were objects of pride. By 1913, Singer controlled roughly 90% of the American home sewing machine market. That level of dominance is almost unimaginable today. The company wasn't just competing in the market, it practically was the market. Factories were producing thousands of machines every week, and the Singer name had become synonymous with sewing itself. To celebrate its incredible success, the company even built a skyscraper in New York City that briefly became the tallest building in the world. Singer had risen from a small workshop invention to a global industrial empire. But beneath that success, hidden behind the impressive factories and polished machines, another story was quietly unfolding. And it would eventually change everything. By the early 20th century, Singer manufacturing companies seemed almost invincible. The company dominated the global sewing machine market. Its factories produced thousands of machines every week, and its products were sold in nearly every corner of the world. Millions of families relied on Singer machines in their homes, and the brand had become a symbol of industrial success. But beneath this impressive success story, there were growing cracks in the foundation. Inside the massive factories, the reality for many workers was far from glamorous. Factory labor in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was extremely demanding. Employees often worked 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The factory floors were loud, dangerous, and filled with heavy machinery. Metal parts were stamped and shaped by powerful presses, and accidents were not uncommon. Safety regulations were minimal by modern standards. Workers who were injured often received little support, and if someone could no longer work, they were quickly replaced by someone else eager for employment. In some factories during the early years, even children worked alongside adults, performing tasks that required small hands to reach between complex machines. Despite these harsh conditions, workers continued showing up every day because factory jobs were one of the few reliable ways to earn a living during that era. But eventually, frustration began to grow. In the early 1900s, labor movements were spreading across industrial nations. Workers were starting to demand fair wages, shorter working hours, and safer conditions. One of the most significant labor conflicts involving Singer occurred in 1911 at the company's factory in Clydebank, Scotland. After several employees were dismissed, thousands of workers walked out in protest. The strike quickly expanded, and soon tens of thousands of workers joined the movement, demanding better wages and improved working conditions. The strike became one of the largest labor protests in Scottish industrial history. Although the conflict eventually ended, it showed that even the most powerful companies could not ignore the voices of their workers forever. Then the world itself began to change. When World War I began in 1914, industries across the world were forced to adapt to wartime demands. Like many manufacturers, Singer shifted part of its production toward military supplies. Factories that once produced sewing machines began manufacturing equipment and components needed for the war effort. The same thing happened again during World War II. During those years, Singer factories produced parts for aircraft, weapons, and other military equipment. Production expanded dramatically, and employment numbers reached record highs. But after the wars ended, the global economy began shifting in new directions. By the mid-20th century, sewing machines were no longer rare household items. Many families already owned one, and because Singer machines were built to last, people didn't need to replace them very often. At the same time, new competitors entered the market. Manufacturers in countries like Japan and Germany began producing reliable sewing machines at lower costs. These companies introduced new designs, lighter machines, and improved features that appealed to modern consumers. Singer, however, was slower to adapt. The company had grown large and bureaucratic, and many of its factories still relied on aging equipment and outdated production methods. Instead of focusing entirely on improving sewing machines, the company began expanding into unrelated industries such as electronics and aerospace. The strategy was meant to diversify the business, but it also distracted the company from the product that had built its success in the first place. Meanwhile, social changes were transforming everyday life. During the 1960s and 1970s, fewer people relied on sewing machines to make their own clothing. Mass-produced garments had become cheaper and widely available in stores. For many families, sewing shifted from a necessity to more of a hobby. Demand for home sewing machines slowly declined. By the mid-1970s, Singer began experiencing serious financial problems. For the first time in its long history, the company reported significant losses. Factories started shutting down. Production numbers fell. And the once unstoppable empire began shrinking. The most symbolic moment came in 1982. That year, after more than a century of continuous operation, the massive Singer factory in Elizabeth, New Jersey, closed permanently. For generations of workers, the factory had been the center of their community. Parents, children, and even grandparents had worked there. Entire neighborhoods had grown around the steady jobs provided by the company. When the factory closed, thousands of people lost their livelihoods almost overnight. The buildings that once roared with machinery slowly fell silent. Over time, many sections of the complex were abandoned, deteriorating into empty industrial ruins. An empire that had taken more than 100 years to build had collapsed in just a few decades. Today, the Singer name still exists, but in a very different form. The brand is now owned by a large global company that manages several sewing machine brands. Singer machines are still sold around the world, but they are no longer manufactured in the United States. Instead, production takes place in factories across Asia. For many people today, Singer is simply one brand among many in a competitive marketplace. But the story of Singer Manufacturing Company remains one of the most fascinating chapters in industrial history. It is the story of a struggling inventor who created a revolutionary machine, a company that grew into a global empire, and a giant that eventually fell when the world around it changed. The rise and fall of Singer teaches an important lesson. No matter how powerful a company becomes, success is never permanent. Industries evolve, technology advances, markets shift, and those who fail to adapt, even the mightiest giants, can eventually fade into history. But the impact they leave behind can last far longer than the empire itself. For more than a century, Singer helped shape modern manufacturing, transformed household life, and influenced how products are sold around the world. And even today in homes across the globe, old Singer sewing machines still sit quietly, small reminders of a company that once changed the world.